Hi everyone, I'm here with Joseph Twigg today. He's the CEO of Aveni. Aveni are in the natural language processing space with expertise in reg tech and compliance. So Joseph, thanks very much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So we were just chatting earlier a little bit about, I suppose, the journey we've been on around analysing conversations, analysing messaging, analysing interactions.
Yeah, I think it's been a really interesting evolution. Like you said, starting off with recording the majority of calls, the different regulations coming in over the years that was, the catalyst behind that. And then automatic speech recognition really sort of starting the process of utilising the customer voice for analytics. If you go back 7 or 8 years, you probably had the first wave of sort of speech analytics capability. And I think that largely disappointed. Speech recognition was probably not good enough. Too many mistakes in transcripts, too many issues end to end. So the promise and the hype largely underwhelmed in that sort of first phase of adoption. I think over the last couple of years in particular, that's fundamentally changed. The underlying speech recognition capability has dramatically shifted. It's been commoditized by big tech. It's available to anyone with cloud infrastructure very easily. And the underlying scientific progress around different discrete parts of natural language processing has been really amazing. The field has moved so quickly. So from a sort of product perspective, the challenge has been taking bleeding edge research and converting that into a useful tool in situ in part of a workflow or a process. And I think the technology's really come of age. I think speech analytics as a sector has been growing pretty rapidly. There's widespread adoption and things are just about to get very crazy thanks to large language models, the introduction of GPT, Bard and others.
Where do you sort of see the state of evolution in terms of where the majority of people are, given that some people are both ends?
Well, as you said, it's a sort of spectrum, isn't it? I mean, what we typically see now, all large banks, outsourced contact centres, where there are typically high volume, potentially low value interactions, speech analytics is used to drive efficiencies into the process. Number one, there's been a huge push, obviously, to try and push customers down different channels where the cost to serve via web or chatbot is materially less than the cost to serve via a contact centre. But when the contact centres hit, you're seeing the vast majority of those larger, high volume type environments using speech analytics. Where you see very little adoption of speech analytics is in the high value, slightly maybe lower frequency interactions, more complex, whether it's advice, financial advice, things of that nature. There's relatively low adoption in that space, and it's a sort of quite a big opportunity, I think, for a company like Aveni.
And how much do you think it's now becoming expected to be able to do it? It's almost like, people are sort of expecting now to say, well, just listen back to the call when you're in that conversation. Particularly, we've got consumer duty that's going on in the background. Do you think this is going to be expected from an evidencing point of view to be able to recall the conversations and search the conversations, and not just conversations, also messaging and any of the interactions that kind of happen? It feels like we're going that kind of way.
100%. I think the question becomes, why wouldn't you do it when, the requirements to evidence your interactions, to identify circumstances where harm could occur, to really evidence and understand the changing in customer circumstances, these sort of things to do manually is really challenging. To assess the outcome for a customer across their whole customer journey, from when they first took out a product or service to their current circumstances, is a really, really challenging process. That probably requires interaction with multiple systems. If you don't introduce degrees of automation, the impact of that is actually going to be a reduced assurance, probably potentially an unintended consequence for assurance and governance around consumer duty. If people have to spend 10 times more time assessing one case, then, unless you're going to get 10 times more people, the total coverage of assurance you're going to get is going to be less. So, the simple answer is duty will act as a material catalyst for the adoption of this technology, and companies will reap the reward for that. This is not just about ticking a box for compliance. This is about automating process, really driving a scalable operating model, and understanding your customers and driving opportunity from that additional insight that you can get.
At one level, it's almost like this, the power of search, isn't it? So the fact you can search every single interaction and find out what's going on, just like we can with the internet, but being able to do that with all of our interactions, right? It's incredibly powerful, isn't it?
There's an element of that. I think, that capability from a sort of customer contact perspective is already here. You can search any interaction that you've had since you started using our platform through one search bar, and that can be quite an intelligent search as well. I think the recent evolution in this technology has moved that one step further on. So we call it machine assessment, a machine line of defense, if you will, where essentially natural language processing models are performing your compliance monitoring for you. They're performing your quality assurance for you. They're performing your consumer duty assessment for you. And that is done for every single interaction across the board. And instead of having to search through your sort of backlog of customer interactions to find something, the models are triaging the things that you want to search for. So the high-risk interactions, the indications of harm, the changes in circumstances, things of that nature, they're flagging those to your teams, vulnerable customers. You need to take a look at this customer, their circumstances have just changed. That goes to the top of your pile from an assurance perspective.
I asked you about 100% call recording. It's like, why would you not do it? Why would you not do 100% analysis, interaction analysis? And we have it from a business point of view. I suppose the scary thing is, what would it be like if are we going to have it from a personal point of view? And we already see things, for example, like cameras going on people's chests, or recording much more on video. Everything can now be recorded. Do you think we'll ever get to the point where personally we end up recording all our conversations? And because it'd be very helpful for me in terms of actually remembering what I said.
Who knows? I think, you can definitely see an environment where you're in the sort of workplace of the future. As part of your onboarding, you have to potentially read a script so your voice can be recognised and associated with you. And then every meeting room, every interaction you have is standard recorded, with meeting notes and actions automatically generated, with follow-on meetings automatically put into everyone's diary. And that all done by essentially recording meetings and interactions. Again, the capability to do that, like nothing needs inventing to make that happen. The capability is here. But you can see scenarios like that definitely emerging. And that also equalises a little bit the sort of the hybrid work pattern, being able to capture both sides of your work life, both in the office and via VC.
I mean, ChatGPT has kind of come up. I think it's the fastest growing launch that's ever taken place. It keeps getting time. I think it went to like a million, first time to a million customers, was reading today, in in 5 days, I think it was, or a million users in 5 days. It's been the fastest ever. So there's been a lot of chat about that and other, so I suppose, GPT or generative text programs, tools that have been out there, including like Microsoft, etc. What's your kind of view in terms of where that technology goes?
Yeah, it fundamentally changes everything. I think the last time we've seen something like this in the context of impact was probably the internet. But then the internet seemed to take sort of 10, 15 years to hit a common standard of adoption for businesses, and it took quite a while. This has gone from sort of 0 to 100 for most people in the space of a few months. And you fast forward 10 years and look at the way businesses operate, there won't be many things that people can do in the service industry in particular, but across lots and lots of industries, that these large language models won't really outperform. I think the CEO of OpenAI, who's obviously behind ChatGPT, was clearly stated, like within that time frame, he would expect large language models to be able to outperform humans at almost every economically valuable task.
Yeah.
So, and then you look at companies of the stature of Google and Microsoft getting so flustered. You know, Google wiped off $170 billion from its share price in a week due to the botched release of Bard and having some sort of mistake in the marketing materials. It's not often you see companies of that size and scale get so flustered. Soft completely ripping up its approach to releasing products, like absolutely out of character for Microsoft to rush the release of Bing GP and just let it go out in the wild with a million users. They did that basically to get user feedback and research on a scale that they couldn't possibly do themselves, but they also really risking their brand doing that. So you see companies getting of that scale, the biggest tech companies in the world, that should give you an indication of what they think their potential is here.
Do you think it is like the internet a little bit in terms of almost like when you have that, we had that initial growth, the internet was almost like magic at first, right? It's a bit like ChatGPT is. It's kind of like it happens first, we could find everything, and you used to surf the internet. Remember that, you used to surf the internet. No one does that part of daily life. But we went through that wave, and then you had the dot-com crash, and then you got to the real sort of use cases. Do you think we're still in that change curve where it's almost like heavy adoption, and we're bored by the magic of it, getting us, I don't know, composing poems in the style of Shakespeare and those kind of things, as much as the actual use cases? Has it got a bit of maturity to go, do you think?
I think the demonstration of the underlying capability, which is fundamental to so many processes, so the ability to understand context, retain that understanding for additional questions, the question answering approach, the visualization and text generation. These capabilities can be used in so many things, from PR generation, chatbots, through to writing code. You know, the applications are so broad, and I think the demonstration of that capability has been so good, and really surprised on the upside with ChatGPT. I don't think there's much more to go from that context. I think the core capability has been demonstrated in a way that is very clear. Like this, it's unambiguous what the potential is. In terms of adopting the technology for specific use cases, there is a very long way to go. So a live example, I got access to Bing GPT. As you do, the first thing you ask is, who is Joseph Twigg? And it wrote a summary of me and my experience. And it said Joseph Twigg is the CEO of Aveni. Formerly, Joseph was a senior consultant at Accenture.
Yeah.
I've never worked at Accenture.
Yeah.
Everything else it got in that statement was absolutely bang on, perfectly right. It just got this one bit that it said that I worked at Accenture. I've never had any relationship, never done anything with Accenture. It hallucinated that. That level of reliability required for specific use cases is quite a challenge. These things are trained on very broad data sets. You've got to add additional domain expertise, domain systems, additional information retrieval, additional controls and guardrails to resolve the adoption gap for specific use cases. And this sort of middle layer, the gap between a large language model, not necessarily GPT, there's multiple in the pipes, and the specific adoption, these specific use cases, is going to be where lots of time and effort is spent. I think right now you can see loads of use cases that it can be used for, generating market material, generating PR, any sort of copywriting, giving humans a new starting point from which they start their job. But for an AI advisor giving financial advice without any human intervention, I don't think anything new needs inventing to do that. But we're a long way off it in terms of providing the assurity that it's correct.
I mean, one of the things, the concepts I've been chatting to a few people about is whether the fact if you're talking to a human and you're getting advice from a human, do you have a different expectations around its accuracy, and it's on both sides, whether you're giving the advice or not. You have different interpretation around the accuracy or the expectation around accuracy versus if you're talking with a computer. And we've pretty much been ingrained around the computer is always right, even when it's not. The expectation is that the information is going to be blocked down and it should be all correct. Well, if you're talking with a human, if I made a mistake, you might say, well, no, I didn't do that. And I'll say, oh, okay, well, I made a mistake. But the computer probably doesn't say that, right? So I mean, our expectations different, and probably rightly so, but is that something we're going to have to deal with, do you think, particularly when you're talking about probabilistic type models in terms of generating text and those kind of things?
Yeah, this is a very well understood field in human-computer interaction. There's some really good examples of it over the last few years. If you take autopilot at Tesla, if there's a crash on autopilot, it's headline news. The same day, there were probably 1,000 crashes in exactly the same scenario that were human error that don't make the news at all, and it's all because of who do you blame?
Yeah.
Like whose fault is it? Where does the liability lie? So yeah, human-computer interaction, the sort of instinct not to trust a computer-derived output if there's any ambiguity or if it's wrong, it's really strong. We see it all the time. If there's an error in a transcript, people are like, oh, that, what's that?
How can they make that mistake?
That's not correct. And then they listen to the audio.
Yeah.
And like, oh God, yeah, now I can see why it said that, because it sounds like, the output of the speech recognition is what the audio sounds like. But there's this instinct to be like, oh, it's wrong, whereas you don't really get that with humans. So yeah, I mean, that burden of proof is high. And look, I think when you've got something that in principle is infinitely scalable, you're maybe one human making a mistake, it's that one person. If you could magnify that mistake across the total population, it'd be a much bigger problem. And that's the potential of systems like these. So you need that. You need the guardrails, you need the controls, you need the assurance to make sure these systems are performing.
Going back to your example around meetings, or even in terms of like conversations that might be happening, it's almost like that transcript of what actually happened, but then also the summarization, I think, is particularly interesting. You're in a meeting and you use something like a GPT model to basically say, well, look, what are the summary bullet points, who are the actions, those kind of things. I mean, it feels like that's tantalizingly close and could really save us a lot of time.
So right now you can summarize a meeting GPT, but it will give you a generic summary of a meeting that might be useful, that might not, that might be accurate, that might not, and that's what it'll give you. We've developed a solution already using large language models, one of them powered by GPT, that is designed to take the output of a financial advice meeting and generate all the documentation required. So summarise the output in the context with the voice of the customer, capture all the risk assessment, the income, the goals, summarise that in a way that a financial advisor would write it, populate a suitability report. So when you finish the meeting, you can press generate email and it will generate an email summarising the conversation and send that. You can press generate notes for a paraplanner. It will generate the notes for a paraplanner. You can press generate suitability and it will populate a suitability letter. That's probably 5 or 6 hours of low value administration that you could resolve immediately. The journey to get there is being super, super challenging. So we had one example, a really good example. These are all obviously sort of demo scenarios, but literally based on very real meetings. The client mentioned in their assets that they owned a house, but they didn't talk about the value of the house. GPT by itself hallucinated a value for the house in the summarization. It just gave it a value.
Yeah.
And we're like, wow, where's that come from?
Yeah.
So the process of prompt engineering, so what questions do you need to ask these large language models? What restrictions do you need to say? You need to literally tell them, if you're not sure, don't put it in. It's that level of interaction in it, and you have to go through this process of refining the way you interact with these models, of adding additional restrictions, additional systems that it pulls information, gold standard information from, before you can rely on it. But when you get, it's fascinating. I mean, you can literally, we could finish this meeting and we could have notes, actions, emails generated. If you want to write me a letter to thank me, that could be generated, and that's instant. That's done.
And that really feels like almost like an initial use case. Outside, certainly of the ones that I would be close to, is because it does save so much time, and you can generate it, and you can get around any kind of like bias to a certain extent because it's summarization of what's actually happened. So it's almost like, here's the transcript, or here's the audio, and here's the transcript if you really want to go back to it, but here's a summary to basically save you time. And it feels like that's almost like a first really valuable use case. I'm chomping at the bit to get to it, to be honest.
Well, the real IP and magic sauce in what we've done in this particular use case is you can highlight any section of the summary, and it will give you a list of data points, where that data's come from. So you can validate immediately any material data points by just highlighting them, and it will take you back to the source of that data. And that traceability component is absolutely essential to meet the reliability sort of requirements, and even the perception requirements. You think about the human-computer interaction chat we just had. You've got to give the user confidence that this is getting it right. And we can highlight, we can give confidence levels, we can do all of that. And that gives it traceability, and that enables the use. We'll put our hands up and say, this has to be human plus right now. I wouldn't attach that to a robo-advisor and take humans completely out of the loop. You still want a human to read the email and validate. You want them to, we can extract from the conversation to populate a CRM system. Read that first, make sure you're happy with it before you're populating it. Read the suitability letter. But your starting point for this admin has just moved from 0 to 95. And if you multiply this over companies with large teams, the savings here can be material. And this is a relatively simple use case in the context of the power of these models. It's logically the first thing to tackle, but you can throw documents into that. All of a sudden, you can ask GPT a question about multiple documents and do a case assessment. These things, like I said, are on the cusp. They're pretty much ready now. So,
and one of the things I did find, which is because of it interesting around the actual maths behind it, and because it's probability and maths, and as I kind of understand it, is if you sort of throw summaries of summaries of summaries into ChatGPT, then it comes out with an average of all of them, right? So you can go from quite sort of specific. If you do it almost like first level, we don't get it second or third level, it becomes the averages of the averages, and you get very generic kind of content. And also, if you ask the same question, every time it comes back with the same answer, unless you've changed one of the variables slightly, it feels like. So there's almost like that element of creativity and making mistakes that humans do, which sort of generates different kind of outcomes. I mean, is that something you've got to be careful of even with language models? Like, you've got to stay quite close to the data, otherwise it becomes almost like bland to a certain extent, or just generic.
Yeah, I'd say that's the difference between hearing a product with this sort of technology versus using the sort of retail off-the-shelf version is highlighted very much by what you give there. So, I mean, there are multiple parameters you can set within the model in terms of the level of precision and things of that nature, the length of the summary. But really, you can set a whole range of prompted rules that define the output in the way that you want it. I think the honest truth is, at the moment, and the whole world is in the same position, determining what the gold standard, we refer to that as prompt engineering, determining what the gold standard prompt engineering is for each output within each use case is a matter of trial and error, experimentation, adding different tooling in. This is what every company that's trying to adopt GPT is pretty much doing at the moment, trying to figure out the best, most reliable way to use the underlying capability for use cases. Yeah. But you don't want, I think, for the majority of the use cases that we're currently working on, the actual knowledge, the output, is not coming from GPT. The text generation and the summarization and the contextual understanding, all that stuff is GPT, but GPT is pulling in knowledge from separate systems to give us that guarantee that the output is accurate.
But I suppose it's just like humans, isn't it? You can have a copywriter, but if you want to have a copywriter writing stuff specifically around a specific industry, you have to be tweaked, essentially. You have a specialist person doing it who knows a little bit about the industry, so you have to blend the two together almost.
Exactly. It's that domain expertise needs to be reflected as a knowledge base in the system. I think from a business perspective, especially working in a regulated industry where the hurdles for use are going to be quite high from a regulatory perspective, reliability control is essential. So turn off any creativity and any sort of license to hallucinate. I mean, that is super important. The other hat, which is just sort of general usage and creativity, it's mind-blowing how you can utilize what essentially is a mathematical model and trained on lots of data to be so creative. You can, we've seen examples of people asking to write a song from an artist that no longer writes songs. Oasis have just got back together. The brothers now love each other. They're releasing an album. They've appointed you, GPT, as the chief songwriter. Write the big hit off their album, and it will write a song. And it will write that song from a combination of the language that's in other Oasis songs. And it'll do it within seconds. It's mind-boggling. And the scary thing is, and this is where you hear the Elon Musks of the world continually highlighting the dangers of this technology. For all intents and purposes, we're at the sort of start of this journey. The power of these models, in fact, next week is going to materially improve on the release of GPT-4.
Is that next week? Okay.
And, over coming years, I don't think anyone working in this has yet found a ceiling. There's no sort of Moore's law. There's nothing limiting the growth at the moment. They're throwing data, these models, and it's continually improving them. I'm sure there will be a cap before they're refined, but, we're at the start of the journey with these models. And that's a genuinely scary thing when they're so good, notwithstanding the challenges of adoption.
Well, so I have a last question. We've come a huge way, and you can see just the excitement and the amount of work that's going on underneath the scenes, getting to the immediate future. It's incredibly interesting. But where do you think we go from here? I mean, what do you think the trends are going to be in terms of the next 5 years? Trends in terms of implementation, and what we're going to see, particularly from a business point of view, in terms of like implementations on the floor.
I mean, if your time frames for that question is 5 years, I would expect pretty much every single role in a company within the financial services to have a new starting point powered by large language models. Like things that have been historically difficult, if you think about compliance assurance, for every single customer interaction having a comprehensive assessment of vulnerability, consumer duty, suitability, changing circumstances, all driven by large language models. So I think adoption of these models, the functional areas and role and jobs within the business that powering will be pervasive within 5 years. It'll be everywhere. Will that result in a material change in the structure of the workforce within that time frame? I don't think so. I think it will be human plus quite a lot of the time. I think it'll be new experiences for customers, new levels of automation, new levels of insight, new products, new areas of competition. I don't think it will materially change the structure of the workforce, but you open that time frame out another 5 or 10 years, and at least the potential for that is there. Essentially, to a marketing department that used to have 10 people in it might only need 2, just because the majority of the underlying work, when a large language model is tuned into your internal knowledge bases, is trained on the tenor and tone of your corporate voice, when you're generating materials, whether in text, video, images, your starting point is going to be 99% the way there. So you might find that traditional functions can be supported by far less people, but actually the output is broadly the same as a similar process to what's happening now. But I would expect the impact to be huge. I think Regulation is going to be key here. Is regulation going to speed things up, slow things down? When are they going to catch up? And I think actually, national sort of governments are quite important in this space as well. I mean, at what point does all of UK business being powered by models that are hosted and created by a different country become something that a government should really think about? Yeah. So it's going to be a very interesting space.
Yeah. When you see that with evidencing, and the fact that it can be done means now that it's going to be asked for it to be done, and it's like that sort of, the trend is for more involvement and more use of it. I think it kind of feels it's going that way.
I think so. I think, look, there needs to be a sober assessment beyond the hype, a very sort of steady, controlled adoption road, and things have to be done in the right way. You see the propensity for headlines in this space, and I've got no doubt that there will be some attention-grabbing headlines over the next year or two with things going wrong.
Yeah.
So it's all about doing things in the right way, taking appropriate control, and not trying to go from stage 1 to stage 5, putting the appropriate guardrails in place.
Well, Joseph, thanks very much for the time and explaining it all to me as well. So and in terms of where we're currently sitting, because it is fascinating in terms of where it is. I mean, I think some of the things that you're at the forefront of in terms of the compliance and how you interpret it, it sounds very exciting in terms of just being able to do that search function, right, and really understand it and work out what's going on and how to improve things for customers. So it's a very exciting space, and I appreciate you making the time. So thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Chris.